I walked into his ballroom like I owned it, like I hadn't spent the last 3 months crying into silk pillowcases over a man who thought exclusivity was optional, and the dress I chose was a calculated act of war, crimson silk that poured over my body like liquid sin, the kind of dress that made grown men forget their own names. And I knew the exact moment he saw me, because the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees, and every man within his line of sight suddenly remembered they had somewhere else to be. But I didn't look at him. Not yet, because the first rule of revenge is making them wait, making them wonder, making them realize that the woman they took for granted is the same woman who just became every other man's fantasy. And I could feel his eyes on me like hands, possessive and furious, tracking every step I took across that marble floor. And God, it felt good, felt powerful, felt like finally, I was the one holding all the cards while he sat there drowning in the consequences of his own arrogance. The music was slow and deliberate, the kind that makes you move your hips without thinking about it. And when the first man approached me, some investment banker with more money than sense, I let him take my hand, let him pull me onto the dance floor where everyone could see, where he could see, and I melted into this stranger's arms like I'd been doing it all my life, tilted my head back and laughed at something he said, and I didn't need to look to know my mob boss was watching, could feel the violence radiating off him from across the room, and some dark, twisted part of me loved it, loved knowing that I could make him feel even a fraction of the jealousy that had nearly killed me when I found out about her, about the way he'd touched her while still coming home to my bed, still whispering promises against my skin that he had no intention of keeping. And the banker's hand slid lower on my waist, and I let it stay there just a moment too. Long, just long enough for everyone to notice. Just long enough for him to understand that I wasn't his good girl anymore, wasn't the woman who'd sit quietly while he collected other women like trophies. Then a second man cut in, taller, darker, more dangerous, and this one didn't ask permission, just took what he wanted, and his hands were everywhere they shouldn't be, his mouth too close to my ear as he whispered things that should have made me slap him. But instead I smiled, soft and secret, because I wanted him to see this, wanted him to watch another man treat me like I was available, like I was just another pretty thing at a party instead of the queen he'd crowned and then dethroned without warning. And I could see him in my peripheral vision, standing perfectly still with that glass of whiskey frozen halfway to his mouth. And he looked carved from stone, beautiful and terrible. And I knew that look, knew it meant someone was about to bleed. And the reckless part of me that he'd created with his betrayal wanted to push harder, wanted to see him finally lose that iron control, wanted him to feel as out of control as I'd felt every night I lay awake wondering if he was with her, if he was touching her the way he touched me, if he whispered the same lies into her skin. The dangerous man's hand curved around my hip with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no, and I was about to step back, about to remember that I wasn't actually trying to start a bloodbath, when I felt the shift in the air, felt every person in that ballroom collectively hold their breath, and my dance partner's hands disappeared like he'd been burned. And when I turned around, he was simply gone, vanished into the crowd, or maybe into something worse, and the music played on, but nobody was really dancing anymore. Everyone was pretending very hard not to stare at the mob boss who'd just made a man disappear without moving from his spot, without saying a word, just one look, and the threat was eliminated, and I should have been terrified, should have run, but instead my pulse was racing for entirely different reasons, because he'd just claimed me in front of everyone without laying a single finger on me, had reminded the entire room that I might be here without him, but I was still his. And the contradiction of it, the sheer audacity of him being jealous after what he'd done, made me want to scream and laugh and set the whole ballroom on fire. I danced with safer men after that, men who kept their hands appropriate and their eyes respectful, men who understood that touching me now meant signing their own death warrant. But I made sure every laugh was loud enough for him to hear, every smile bright enough for him to see, and I accepted champagne from careful fingers and let my hair fall over one shoulder. In that way I knew drove him crazy, and I was performing, putting on a show specifically designed to torture the one man who'd taught me that love wasn't enough if it didn't come with respect. And hours passed like this delicate dance of provocation and restraint, and I could feel him getting closer, could feel the moment approaching when he'd finally snap, when that legendary control would crack and I'd get to see what I'd been waiting for, what I'd orchestrated this entire evening to witness, and when his hand finally closed around my wrist, when he materialized beside me like smoke and shadows, every nerve ending in my body lit up like I'd been struck by lightning, because no matter how much I hated him, how much I wanted to hurt him the way he'd hurt me. My body still knew his touch, still craved it like oxygen, and that betrayal, that biological treachery, was almost worse than his infidelity. His voice in my ear was barely a whisper, but it cut through the music like a blade. "You're playing with fire, princess," and the nickname that used to make me melt now made me want to draw blood, and I turned to face him, finally, fully. Let myself look at the face I'd loved more than my own reflection, the dark eyes that had seen every part of me, the mouth that had promised me forever and then redefined what forever meant. And I smiled, slow and vicious. "You taught me how to burn, baby. Don't act surprised when I use the skills you gave me." And I watched his jaw tighten, watched that muscle jump in his cheek that meant he was holding back words that could level cities. And he moved closer, so close I could count his eyelashes, so close I could feel the heat coming off his body. And he said, "This isn't you. This isn't who you are," with such absolute certainty that rage flooded through me, hot and bright. And I laughed, actually laughed in his face. "You don't know who I am anymore. You lost the right to know me when you decided one woman wasn't enough, when you thought you could have me waiting at home while you played with your other toys." And something cracked in his expression, something that might have been pain or might have been fury, and for a second I thought he might kiss me or kill me or both, but instead he said, voice rough and low, "She meant nothing." And those 3 words, those pathetic, insufficient 3 words, broke something in me that I didn't know was still whole. "She meant nothing," I repeated, tasting the words. "So you risked everything, risked us, risked this, for nothing. Is that what you're telling me? That I'm crying over nothing? That I've been dying inside for months over absolutely nothing?" And my voice was rising now, all the careful control I'd maintained slipping away. "Do you know what that makes me? If she was nothing and you still chose her over keeping your promises to me, what does that make me?" And he reached for me, but I stepped back, backed away from him like he was poison, because if he touched me now, I'd either shatter or surrender, and I couldn't afford either. Couldn't let him win this when I'd worked so hard to make him feel even a fraction of my pain. And I said, "Quiet now. Deadly. I came here tonight to show you exactly what you lost, to make you watch other men want what you threw away. And judging by the body you just disappeared, I'd say the message was received." And I started to walk away, to leave him standing there in his own ballroom surrounded by his own people, and his hand shot out lightning fast and caught my wrist, gentle but firm, and he pulled me back around, pulled me close enough that anyone watching would think we were about to kiss, and he said, "I made a mistake, the biggest mistake of my life, and I will spend every day proving that to you if you let me." And God help me, I wanted to let him, wanted to fall back into his arms and pretend the last 3 months hadn't happened, but I'd learned the hard way that wanting something and deserving it were 2 very different things. So I looked up at him with tears I refused to let fall and whispered, "You don't get to decide that you want me back just because watching other men touch me made you jealous. You don't get to claim me now because your ego can't handle seeing me move on. You threw me away, and I'm done being something you pick up when it's convenient." And I pulled my wrist free and walked away, and this time he let me go, and that hurt worse than anything, worse than the betrayal, worse than the jealousy, because some part of me had wanted him to fight harder, to refuse to let me leave, and the fact that he didn't, that he just stood there and watched me disappear into the crowd, told me everything I needed to know about how this story was going to end. Chapter 2, The Price of Betrayal. I made it to the bathroom before the tears came, locked myself in the furthest stall, and pressed my palms against the cool marble wall, trying to remember how to breathe, because walking away from him just now had taken every ounce of strength I possessed, and I wasn't sure I had any left. And the worst part, the absolute worst part, was that 3 months ago I would have forgiven him already, would have melted at those words about mistakes and proving himself, would have let him carry me out of that ballroom and back into the beautiful prison of loving a man who didn't understand what loyalty meant. But 3 months ago, I didn't know what I know now, didn't have the memory of finding them together burned into my brain like a brand I'll carry forever. It had been a Tuesday, ordinary and unremarkable, and I'd come home early from lunch with my sister, still laughing about something stupid she'd said, still floating in that blissful ignorance that comes from trusting someone completely. And I'd walked into our penthouse, our home, the place where he'd made love to me 1,000 times and promised me 1,000 more, and I'd heard sounds coming from his office, sounds that made my stomach drop before my brain could catch up. And I'd stood there in the hallway like an idiot, actually debating whether to walk away, whether to pretend I hadn't heard, whether ignorance might actually be bliss. But my feet had carried me forward anyway, had pushed open that door, and there they were. Her bent over his desk with her skirt around her waist, and him behind her with his hand fisted in her hair. And the worst part wasn't the sex, wasn't even the betrayal. It was the look on his face when he saw me, that split second of genuine surprise. Like he'd honestly thought he could do this, could have this, could keep me tucked away in one part of his life while he indulged every other appetite. And I'd stood there frozen while she scrambled to fix her clothes, while he'd said my name like it was a question. And then I'd turned around and walked out, walked all the way to a hotel 3 blocks away, and I hadn't answered his calls for 2 days. Hadn't read his messages, hadn't let him explain, because what explanation could possibly matter when the image of them together was now permanently etched into my memory? When I finally did go back, when I finally let him talk, he'd acted like it was nothing, like I was overreacting, like men in his position didn't do monogamy unless they chose to, and I should have known that, should have understood that. And he'd said, "She doesn't mean anything. You're the one I come home to." Like that was supposed to make it better. Like being his primary choice was supposed to erase the fact that I wasn't his only choice. And I'd realized in that moment that he genuinely didn't understand why I was hurt, genuinely thought that emotional fidelity was enough even if physical fidelity was negotiable. And I'd looked at this man I loved more than breathing and understood that he would never, could never, give me what I needed, because he didn't even understand what I was asking for. And so I'd smiled, I'd kissed him, I'd let him think everything was fine, and I'd started planning, started plotting, started preparing for tonight, for this, for making him feel even a tiny fraction of the devastation he'd caused me. The bathroom door opened and I heard heels clicking on marble, heard female voices laughing about something, and I held my breath until they left, until I was alone again with my reflection and my racing heart, and I looked at myself in the mirror, at this woman in a red dress with smudged mascara and fury in her eyes, and I barely recognized her, because the girl who'd fallen in love with a mobster 3 years ago would never have orchestrated public humiliation, would never have used other men as weapons, would never have walked away from him twice in one night. But that girl was dead, killed the moment she'd walked in on her boyfriend fucking someone else in their home. And this new version, this harder, sharper, more dangerous version, she was a survivor, and survivors didn't forgive. They adapted, they evolved, they learned to bite back. I fixed my makeup, reapplied my lipstick, the same shade of red as my dress, the color of violence and passion, and I walked back out into that ballroom with my head high and my armor back in place, and I could see him immediately, standing exactly where I'd left him like he'd been frozen there, and our eyes met across the room, and something passed between us, something electric and awful and absolutely inevitable. And I knew with the kind of certainty that settles in your bones, that this wasn't over, that we were nowhere near finished destroying each other, and the thought should have scared me, but instead it sent adrenaline singing through my veins, because at least pain meant feeling something, at least rage meant caring, and numbness, that terrible gray numbness that had swallowed me whole for weeks after his betrayal, that was so much worse than this beautiful, terrible fury. Days turned into weeks, and I played my role perfectly, showed up at his events looking devastating and untouchable, let men approach me but never let them get too close, walked the razor's edge between provocation and actual infidelity, and it was driving him insane. I could see it in the way his control started fraying, in the way he'd appear wherever I was like a dark shadow, watching, waiting, trying to figure out my endgame. And the truth was, I didn't have one, didn't have a plan beyond making him suffer, beyond making him understand that actions had consequences and betrayal had a price. And every time he tried to talk to me, I'd smile and walk away. Every time he tried to corner me, I'd slip through his fingers like smoke. And I could see the frustration building, could see him struggling with the realization that money and power and violence couldn't fix this, couldn't force me back into his life, couldn't make me forget what he'd done. There was a charity gala 3 weeks after the ballroom incident. Black tie and champagne and everyone who mattered in his world, and I wore white this time, virginal and pure, a deliberate mockery of everything we both knew I wasn't anymore. And I danced with a senator's son, a tech billionaire, a rival crime lord who had the audacity to tell me I was wasted on a man who didn't appreciate me. And I'd laughed and agreed and let him hold me close enough that everyone would talk, that the gossip would reach him within minutes. And when I finally saw him that night, he looked almost haggard, looked like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. And good. I wanted him exhausted, wanted him tormented, wanted him to lie awake at night, wondering if I was with someone else the way I'd lain awake wondering about him and her. He cornered me on a balcony, away from the crowd, and his voice when he spoke was raw in a way I'd never heard before. "How long are you going to punish me?" And I turned to look at him. This beautiful, damaged, dangerous man who'd held my heart and then crushed it. And I said, "Until it stops hurting. And right now, baby, it still hurts like hell." And he moved closer, close enough that I could see the shadows under his eyes. Close enough that I could smell his cologne mixed with whiskey and desperation. And he said, "I can't sleep, can't think, can't function knowing you're out there letting other men touch you." And I smiled, vicious and sweet. "Now you know how it feels. Now you understand what you put me through every time you touched her, every time you made a choice that wasn't me." And he flinched, actually flinched. And I'd never seen him react to anything with visible pain before. And something in my chest cracked just a little. But I couldn't let it show, couldn't let him see that hurting him was hurting me too. Because if I did, I'd lose, would fall right back into the cycle of forgiving and forgetting, and pretending that love was enough when respect was absent. "I ended it," he said suddenly, urgently. "The day you found us, I ended it. I told her to leave and never come back. I haven't touched anyone since you, haven't even looked at anyone since you." And I wanted to believe him. God, how I wanted to believe him. But belief required trust. And trust was something he'd shattered so completely, I didn't know if I'd ever find all the pieces. So I said, "That doesn't change what you did, doesn't erase the memory, doesn't make me forget. That you thought I was disposable enough to risk." And I walked away again, left him standing on that balcony alone, and I didn't look back even though every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run to him, to let him hold me and promise me it would never happen again. Because promises were just words, and words were cheap, and I'd learned the hard way that actions were the only currency that mattered. And his actions had shown me exactly where I stood in his list of priorities, and it wasn't at the top, wasn't even close. And until that changed, until he proved with more than words that I was worth choosing every single day, I couldn't let myself fall back into his orbit, couldn't let myself become the woman who forgave betrayal simply because love demanded it. Hey everyone, it's Lena here. If you're loving this story as much as I am, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any chapters of this intense saga. Things are going to get even more exciting from here on out, I promise. Let's go. Chapter 3, When Power Breaks. I started going to places I knew he'd never expect me. Underground clubs where the music pounded so hard you could feel it in your chest. Art gallery openings in parts of the city he didn't control. Poetry readings in bookstores that smelled like old paper and rebellion. And I did it deliberately, methodically, erasing myself from his world piece by piece. And every time his men reported back to him, every time he heard I was somewhere without his protection. Somewhere. Dangerous. I knew it was killing him, knew that his need to control extended to keeping me safe even when I didn't want his protection. And there was something delicious about using his own nature against him, about making his protective instincts into a weapon that only hurt him. I met someone at one of those gallery openings, an artist with paint-stained fingers and eyes that actually saw me instead of just seeing a mobster's ex-girlfriend, and his name was James, and he was completely, utterly normal. No violence in his past, no blood on his hands, just a guy who painted cityscapes and laughed easily and didn't make me feel like I was constantly walking a tightrope over an abyss. And I let him buy me coffee, let him walk me through his studio, let him kiss me goodnight on my doorstep, like we were normal people living normal lives. And it was nice, genuinely nice. And that scared me more than anything because nice had never been enough before. Safety had never been enough before. I'd always craved the danger, the intensity, the feeling of being consumed by someone who burned too hot to touch. And James was lukewarm water when I'd spent years drinking fire. But maybe that was exactly what I needed. Maybe I needed to learn that love didn't have to hurt to be real. Except I couldn't stop thinking about him. About the mob boss I was trying so hard to forget. Couldn't stop wondering what he was doing. If he was sleeping. If he was suffering the way I'd suffered. And it was pathetic, really. How completely he'd ruined me for anyone else. How even when I was with James, sweet, uncomplicated James, my mind was across the city imagining dark eyes and dangerous hands and a voice that could command empires or whisper my name like a prayer. And I hated myself for it. Hated that betrayal hadn't killed my love, had only twisted it into something sharper, something that cut us both. The night everything changed started ordinary enough. I was at dinner with James at some trendy restaurant in Soho, and he was telling me about his next exhibition, and I was nodding and smiling and trying to focus on his words instead of the empty feeling in my chest that nothing seemed to fill. And then I felt it, that familiar shift in the air that meant he was near, that awareness that prickled across my skin like electricity. And I looked up, and there he was, standing at the bar with a whiskey in his hand and murder in his eyes, and he wasn't even pretending not to stare, was just watching me with this intensity that made my pulse race and my hands shake. And James noticed, followed my gaze, and I watched the color drain from his face when he realized who was watching us, because everyone in this city knew that face, knew that reputation, knew that crossing him meant disappearing. "Is that?" James started, and I cut him off. "Yes, and I should have been angry that he'd followed me here, that he couldn't let me have one normal evening, one moment of peace, but instead I was exhilarated, was already standing up, already excusing myself, already walking toward him like a moth to a flame that would absolutely burn me alive. And when I reached him, he didn't say anything, just grabbed my wrist and pulled me outside, into the alley behind the restaurant where the city noise faded to a distant hum, and we were finally, dangerously alone. "You're dating him," he said, and it wasn't a question, was an accusation, and I laughed. Actually laughed, because the hypocrisy was stunning. "I'm having dinner with him, which is more than I can say about what you were doing with her in our home." And his hand tightened on my wrist, not enough to hurt, but enough to remind me that he could, that underneath the expensive suit he was still a predator, still dangerous. And he said, "He's not good enough for you." And I stepped closer, close enough to smell his cologne, close enough to see the exhaustion etched into his face. And I whispered, "Neither were you, apparently, since you needed to fuck someone else to feel satisfied." And something in him snapped. I could see it happen, could see the moment his legendary control finally broke, and he slammed his other hand against the brick wall beside my head, caging me in, and his face was inches from mine. And he said, voice rough and desperate, "I fucked up. I know I fucked up. I've known it every single day since you walked in on us. Every single night I lie awake remembering the look on your face, and I would give anything, do anything, to take it back, to be worthy of you again." His words hit me like physical blows, each one landing in the exact places I was most vulnerable, and I could feel tears burning behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall, refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. So I said, "You want to be worthy of me? Then prove it. Prove that I'm not just another possession you can't stand to lose. Prove that you actually love me, and not just the idea of owning me." And he leaned in closer, so close that his lips almost brushed mine, and he said, "How? Tell me how, and I'll do it." And I looked into his eyes, those dark, dangerous eyes that had seen me at my most vulnerable, my most broken, and I said, "Let me go. Really let me go. Stop following me. Stop sending your men to watch me. Stop making other men disappear for touching me. Let me live my life without you. And if you can do that, if you can respect my choice even when it's not the choice you want, then maybe I'll believe you've." The silence that followed was deafening, was loaded with everything we weren't saying, and I could see him struggling, could see the war happening behind his eyes between what he wanted and what I needed, and for a long moment I thought he might refuse, might tell me that he couldn't, that asking him to let me go was like asking him to stop breathing. But then he stepped back, released my wrist, put physical distance between us even though I could see how much it cost him, and he said, voice barely above a whisper, Okay, I'll let you go. I'll stay away. But know this. Know that every second I'm not with you is torture. Know that I'm not giving up on us. I'm just giving you space. And when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be waiting." And then he turned and walked away, actually walked away from me, left me standing in that alley with my heart pounding and tears finally spilling down my cheeks. And I didn't know if I'd just won or lost. Didn't know if his letting me go was growth or giving up. And the uncertainty was almost worse than the anger had been. I went back inside, back to James, who was still sitting at our table looking nervous, and I sat down and tried to smile, tried to pretend my entire world hadn't just shifted on its axis. And James said, "Are you okay?" And I wanted to say yes, wanted to lie and pretend that I was fine, that seeing him hadn't affected me. But instead I said, "No, I'm not. I'm sorry, James. You're wonderful. You're exactly the kind of man I should want. But I can't do this. Can't date you when I'm still completely destroyed over someone else." And I watched disappointment flash across his face, but also relief, because he'd known, had probably known from the first moment that I was never really there with him, was always somewhere else, with someone else. And he nodded and said, "I understand. I hope you figure it out. Hope he deserves you." And I left, walked out into the New York night alone. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was running from something. Felt like maybe I was finally running toward something, toward clarity, toward understanding, toward figuring out if love could survive betrayal, or if some breaks were too complete to ever heal. Days passed and he kept his word. I didn't see him at events, didn't find his men following me, didn't hear about anyone disappearing for looking at me wrong, and the freedom should have felt good, should have felt like victory, but instead it felt empty, felt like I'd won the battle but lost something essential in the process. And I caught myself looking for him in crowds, listening for his voice, reaching for my phone to text him before remembering that I'd asked him to stay away. And the realization hit me like a freight train one random Tuesday afternoon, hit me while I was walking through Central Park watching couples hold hands, that I didn't want him to stay away, didn't want this distance, didn't want to be free of him. I wanted him, wanted us, wanted to find a way back to each other that didn't require me to forget what he'd done, but maybe allowed me to forgive it, to understand that people were flawed, and love was complicated, and perfection was a myth I'd been chasing at the expense of something real. I found myself outside his building that night, standing on the sidewalk looking up at the penthouse windows, trying to find the courage to go inside, to tell him that I was done punishing him, done punishing us, that I wanted to try again, to build something new from the ashes of what we'd destroyed, and I was about to walk away, about to lose my nerve, when the doorman recognized me and smiled and said, "Miss, he's not home, hasn't been home in days. Word is he's been staying at the office, barely sleeping, barely eating," and concern flooded through me, sharp and immediate, because for all his faults, for all the ways he'd hurt me, I still loved him, still needed him to be okay even when we weren't. And I said, "Thank you," and I headed toward his office building, toward the place where this had all started, where I'd found him with her, where my heart had broken into a million pieces. And maybe it was time to see if those pieces could be put back together into something even stronger than before. Chapter 4. The Game Turns Deadly. I found myself outside his office building at midnight, telling myself I was just checking if he was okay, just making sure he hadn't completely self-destructed. But the truth was darker than that, more twisted, because some part of me wanted to see him suffering, wanted to witness firsthand the devastation I'd caused, wanted to know that I had the same power over him that he'd always had over me. And when the doorman told me he'd been living there for days, barely eating, barely sleeping, I felt this rush of satisfaction so intense it scared me. Because when had I become the kind of woman who found pleasure in someone else's pain? And the answer was simple, brutal, honest. I became that woman the moment I walked in on him with her, the moment he shattered my trust and taught me that love was just another weapon people used to destroy each other. The elevator ride to his floor felt endless, my reflection staring back at me from the mirrored walls, and I looked different than I had months ago, harder somehow, sharper, like I'd been filed down to my most dangerous edges. And I was wearing black tonight, a dress that hugged every curve and ended high enough on my thigh to be a statement. And I'd chosen it deliberately, had put on the perfume he loved, and the heels that made my legs look endless, because if I was going to walk back into that office, back into the scene of my greatest humiliation, I was going to do it looking like every fantasy he'd ever had and could no longer touch. And when the doors opened, I could hear music playing, something dark and instrumental, and I followed the sound to his office, pushed open the door without knocking, and there he was. He was standing at the window with a glass of whiskey in one hand, still in his suit pants, but his shirt was unbuttoned, tie gone, and even from behind I could see the exhaustion in every line of his body, could see the way he'd lost weight, the way his clothes hung differently, and he said without turning around, voice rough like he'd been screaming or crying or both, "I said I didn't want to be disturbed," and I stepped inside, closed the door behind me with a click that sounded impossibly loud in the quiet room, and I said, "Since when do I follow your orders?" And he spun around so fast his whiskey almost spilled, and the look on his face when he saw me was everything I'd wanted, shock and hunger and desperate hope all tangled together. And I watched him try to compose himself, watched him reach for that iron control he was famous for, but his hands were shaking slightly, and that told me everything I needed to know about how close to the bee. "You're here," he said. And it sounded like a prayer, or maybe a curse, and I walked further into the room, my heels clicking on the hardwood floor, hips swaying because I knew he was watching, knew his eyes were tracking every movement, and I said, "I heard you've been destroying yourself. Thought I should come see if the rumors were true." And he laughed, bitter and sharp, concerned about me now. How generous. And there it was, that bite, that edge, the return of the man who didn't beg, who took what he wanted and apologized never. And I smiled because this I could work with. This was the game I knew how to play. And I said, "Not concerned, curious, there's a difference." And I moved closer, close enough to see the dark circles under his eyes, the stubble on his jaw, the way his shirt was wrinkled like he'd slept in it, and God, he looked wrecked and it was beautiful. He set his glass down on the desk, the same desk where I'd found him with her, and the memory should have made me leave, should have made me run, but instead, it fueled something dark in me, something that wanted to reclaim this space, wanted to erase her from every surface he'd touched. And he said, "Why are you really here?" His voice dropping lower, more dangerous, and I could see him shifting, could see him remembering who he was, what he was, a man who controlled empires and made people disappear with a phone call, and he was trying to intimidate me, trying to regain the upper hand, but I'd learned too much, had become too dangerous myself, and I said, "Maybe I missed you. Maybe I wanted to see if you were really suffering, or if it was all an act to make me feel guilty." And I watched anger flash across his face, quick and hot, and he moved toward me with that predatory grace that had always made my pulse race, and he said, "You think I'm acting? You think this is some manipulation?" And he gestured at himself, at the evidence of his decline. "I've lost 15 pounds, haven't slept more than 2 hours a night, can't focus on anything except wondering where you are and who you're with, and if you're letting them touch you the way I used to touch you." His honesty was a weapon, and he knew it, was using it deliberately to crack my armor, and I should have stepped back, should have maintained distance, but instead I moved closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne mixed with whiskey and exhaustion, and I said, "Good, I want you to suffer, want you to feel a fraction of what I felt, want you to lie awake at night imagining me with someone else the way I imagined you with her." And his jaw clenched, that muscle jumping in, his cheek that meant he was barely holding on to his control, and he said, voice rough, Are you fucking him? That artist? That safe little nobody who probably paints you like you're something precious?" And the jealousy in his voice sent heat pooling in my stomach, liquid and dangerous. And I smiled. Would it matter if I was? Would it change anything? You don't get to be jealous anymore. You lost that right. And he stepped even closer, invaded my space completely. And he said, "I'll always be jealous. I'll always want to kill any man who touches you. That doesn't go away just because I fucked up." We were inches apart now, close enough that I could feel the heat coming off his body, could see the way his pupils were dilated, could feel the electricity crackling between us like it always had, like it always would. And I said, "You don't own me anymore." And he said, "I never owned you. You're not something that can be owned, but you were mine, and I was yours, and I destroyed that, and I'll regret it every day for the rest of my life." And his hand came up, almost touched my face, but stopped just short, hovering there like he was afraid I'd shatter if he made contact. And I could see the want in his eyes, the desperate need, and some cruel part of me enjoyed it, enjoyed having this power over him, enjoyed watching him struggle, and I leaned in closer, so close our lips almost touched, and I whispered, "You want to touch me?" And he said, voice breaking, "More than I want to breathe." And I smiled against his mouth and said, "Too bad," and started to pull away. His control snapped. I felt it happen, felt the moment he stopped trying to be good and just took what he wanted, and his hand fisted in my hair and he kissed me, hard and desperate and absolutely devastating, and I should have pushed him away, should have maintained my boundaries, but my body had been starving for this, for him, and I kissed him back with equal fury, equal need, and it was nothing like our kisses before, was all teeth and anger and months of repressed want, and his other hand gripped my waist, pulled me flush against him, and I could feel how much he wanted me, could feel the evidence of his desire pressing against my stomach, and I bit his lip hard enough to hurt, tasted blood, and he groaned into my mouth like pain from me was pleasure, and his hands were everywhere, sliding up my thigh, gripping my ass, tangling in my hair, trying to touch every part of me at once like he was afraid I'd disappear. I pushed him backward, hard, and he let me walk him back until he hit the desk, the same desk, always that desk, and I pressed against him, my body flush with his, and I could feel his heart hammering, could feel how much this was affecting him, and I slid my hand down his chest, over his stomach, lower, and he sucked in a breath, his eyes going dark with want, and I said, "You miss this, miss me, miss having me," and he said, Every fucking second of every fucking day. And I squeezed him through his pants, just enough pressure to make him hiss. And I said, "You threw this away, had this, had me, and you chose someone else." And he said, "Biggest mistake of my life. I know, please." And I'd never heard him say please before, never heard him beg, and it was intoxicating. Was power more addictive than any drug? I kissed him again, slower this time, deeper, let myself taste him properly, let myself remember what it felt like to be consumed by him, and his hands cupped my face like I was something precious, something breakable, and the gentleness after the fury nearly undid me, nearly made me forget why I was here, what he'd done. But then I pulled back, stepped away from him completely, and I watched confusion and frustration cross his face, and he said, Don't leave, please, don't leave." And I straightened my dress, fixed my hair, and I said, "I came here to see if you were really suffering, and you are, and that should make me happy. But instead it just makes me tired of this game, tired of hurting you, tired of hurting myself." And he reached for me, but I stepped back further, and I said, "But I'm not ready to forgive you, not ready to forget, not ready to trust that this won't happen again the moment temptation presents itself." He looked destroyed, looked like I'd gutted him and left him bleeding on his expensive office floor, and he said, "What do you want from me? Tell me what to do and I'll do it. Tell me how to fix this, and I'll move heaven and earth." And I said, "I want you to prove that you've changed, not with words, not with grand gestures, not with desperation, but with time, with consistency, with showing me through your actions that I'm worth choosing every single day even when it's hard, even when there are easier options." And he said, "I can do that, I will do that." And I said, "We'll see." And I turned to leave, and he said my name, just my name, and something in his voice made me pause, made me look back, and he said, "I love you, I've never stopped loving you, and I know that doesn't fix anything, doesn't erase what I did, but I need you to know that everything I've done since you left has been about trying to become the man who deserves you." I looked at him, really looked at him, at this powerful, dangerous man who'd brought empires to their knees and was now falling apart over me, and I said, "Love isn't enough if it doesn't come with respect, with loyalty, with the fundamental understanding that I'm not an option. I'm not a backup plan. I'm not something you come home to after you've satisfied your other appetites. I'm all or nothing. And until you can give me all, until you can prove that I'm your only choice, your first choice, your every choice, then love is just a pretty word that means nothing." And I walked out, left him standing there in his office with the taste of me still on his lips and the knowledge that he'd had me in his hands, and I'd chosen to walk away anyway. And the power of that, the absolute certainty that I controlled this now, that he would come to me when I was ready and not a moment before, was the first thing that had felt good in months. I made it to the elevator before my knees started shaking, before the adrenaline crash hit me, before I realized what I'd just done, how close I'd come to giving in, how much I'd wanted to stay, to let him touch me properly, to fall back into the familiar comfort of his arms. But I'd held firm, had maintained my boundaries, had proven to both of us that I was stronger than my want, stronger than my love, strong enough to walk away from everything I desired, because I deserved, better than what he'd given me. And when I got outside, the cold night air hit my face and I could breathe again, could think again, could remember that this was about more than want or love or chemistry. This was about respect and trust and building something that could survive more than just passion. And he needed to understand that, needed to really, truly comprehend that I wasn't coming back until he could offer me something real, something lasting, something worth the risk of getting my heart broken all over again. Chapter 5. The Queen Takes the Board. The next 3 weeks were a masterclass in psychological warfare, and I played my role with the precision of a surgeon and the cruelty of someone who'd learned from the best, attending every event, every gala, every opening looking absolutely devastating. And I knew he was watching, knew his men were reporting back every detail of my nights, every smile I gave another man, every hand that touched my waist, and the knowledge that I was torturing him should have made me feel guilty, but instead it made me feel powerful, made me feel like finally I was the one holding all the cards, while he scrambled to figure out how to win a game where the rules kept changing. I went to a charity auction on Thursday wearing emerald green silk that made my eyes look predatory, and within minutes I had 3 different men offering to buy me drinks, to bid on items in my name, to take me to dinner after, and I let them orbit around me like planets around the sun, let some tech entrepreneur lean too close while whispering in my ear, his hand possessive on my lower back, and I could feel him before I saw him, that familiar electricity that made every nerve ending come alive, and when I finally looked across the room, he was standing near the bar with murder in his eyes, watching, and that muscle in his jaw was twitching, and his knuckles were white around his glass. He lasted exactly 20 minutes before he crossed the room, and I could track his progress by the way people instinctively moved out of his path, by the way conversations died as he passed, and when he reached me, the tech entrepreneur fled like his life depended on it, and probably it did. And my mob boss looked at me with those dark eyes that promised retribution and pleasure in equal measure, and he said, voice low enough that only I could hear, "You're playing a dangerous game, princess." And I turned to face him fully, let him see the challenge in my eyes, and I said, "I learned from the best, baby. You taught me that games are only dangerous if you're afraid to lose." And something flickered across his face that might have been pride, or might have been pain, and he moved closer, invaded my space like he had every right to, and he said, "That man had his hands on you." I smiled slow and vicious, and I said, "And what are you going to do about it? You don't own me anymore, remember? You gave up that privilege when you decided one woman wasn't enough." And his hand came up, fingers wrapping around my wrist, gentle but firm. And he said, "I never decided one woman wasn't enough. I decided I was entitled to everything I wanted without consequences, and I was wrong. But that doesn't mean I can stand here and watch other men touch what's mine." And I yanked my wrist free, stepped back, and I said, "I'm not yours. I stopped being yours the moment you touched her, and you don't get to reclaim me just because your ego can't handle seeing me move on." And he flinched like I'd slapped him, and I said, "You want to know what's really dangerous? What keeps me up at night? It's not these men who flirt with me. It's the fact that even after everything I still want you, still crave you, still dream about you, and that terrifies me. Because it means you have power over me that I can't seem to break no matter how hard I try." The honesty surprised both of us, hung in the air between us like a confession, and his expression shifted, softened, and he said, "You think you're the only one terrified? I wake up every morning afraid that today will be the day you finally move on, finally find someone who deserves you, finally stop looking at me like I'm worth the fight. And that fear is worse than anything I've ever faced, worse than rivals, worse than the feds, worse than death, because losing you permanently would destroy me in ways a bullet never could." And he reached for me, but I stepped back, maintained the distance, and I said, "Then you should have thought about that before you risked us." And I drained my champagne and said, "I'm leaving, and you're not going to follow me. You're not going to send your men to watch me. You're going to let me walk out of here, and trust that I'll come back when I'm ready." And his whole body went rigid, every muscle tensing like I'd asked him to cut off his own arm. But he said nothing, just watched me leave, and I made it to the exit before I heard him say my name just once, broken and raw, but I didn't turn around. I started going to places I knew he'd hate, underground clubs and Brooklyn galleries and coffee shops in neighborhoods his influence didn't reach, carving out a life that didn't include him, and men approached me constantly, and I let them buy me coffee, let them walk me home, let them kiss me goodnight on my doorstep, and none of them made me feel anything close to what he did, but they were safe and uncomplicated, and maybe safe was exactly what I needed. I was at a gallery opening in Bushwick 2 weeks later, pretending to understand abstract paintings, when I felt him again, that awareness that prickled across my skin, and I turned around and there he was, standing across the room looking completely out of place in his $1,000 suit surrounded by artists in ripped jeans, and our eyes met, and something passed between us. Something electric and inevitable, and I watched him start to move toward me, and I should have left. But my feet wouldn't move. My body had betrayed me again. He stopped a few feet away, maintained a distance that must have cost him, and he said, "I'm not here to fight, not here to drag you out of here or make a scene. I just needed to see you, needed to make sure you were okay." And I raised an eyebrow, said, "You mean you needed to make sure I wasn't fucking someone else?" And he flinched but didn't deny it, and he said, "That too, yes. I won't lie to you. The thought of you with someone else makes me want to burn the world down. But I'm trying to respect your space, trying to let you have the freedom you need even though it's killing me." And I studied him, really looked at him, and he looked better than he had at his office, like he'd been eating and sleeping again, like he was taking care of himself. "There's someone I want you to meet," I said suddenly, impulsively, and I watched confusion flash across his face, and I grabbed his hand, ignored the way his fingers immediately interlaced with mine like they'd been waiting for permission, and I pulled him across the gallery to where Marcus was standing. Marcus, who was tall and beautiful and completely utterly gay. Marcus, who'd become my best friend over the last few weeks. And I said, "This is Marcus. He's the artist whose work you're pretending to understand." And Marcus grinned, shameless and warm, and said, "So, you're the infamous mob boss who broke my girl's heart. I'd say it's nice to meet you, but she's told me things that make me want to punch you in your very attractive face." And my mob boss looked between us, looked at the way Marcus had his arm around my shoulders, the easy intimacy, and I watched him process, watched him realize, and something like relief flooded his expression. We talked for an hour, the three of us, and it was strange and surreal and almost normal. Marcus telling stories about the art world, my mob boss actually relaxing enough to smile, to joke, to be charming, and I watched him be respectful and kind, and genuinely interested in my new life, trying to fit into it instead of demanding I come back to his. And that shift, that fundamental change in approach, meant more than any grand gesture ever could. And when the night ended, when Marcus hugged me goodbye and told my mob boss to treat me right or face his wrath, my mob boss walked me outside and said, "Thank you for letting me stay, for not kicking me out, for giving me a glimpse of your world." And I said, "You're welcome." And he said, "Can I drive you home?" And I was tired of fighting, tired of being strong, so I said, "Okay." The drive was quiet, charged with everything we weren't saying, and his hand rested on the gear shift between us, close enough to touch but not touching, and I could feel the restraint radiating off him. And when we pulled up outside my building, he put the car in park and said, "I know I don't have the right to ask, but are you happy? Are you okay? Are you healing?" And I turned to look at him, really look at him, and I said, "I don't know. Some days I feel like I'm getting better, and other days the pain hits me all over again, and I hate that you still have this power over me. Hate that I can't seem to let you go no matter how much you hurt me." And he said, "I don't want you to let me go, but I want you to be happy more than I want you to be mine. And if that means stepping back, if that means watching you build a life without me, then I'll do it, because loving you means wanting what's best for you even when it destroys me." I kissed him then, couldn't stop myself, leaned across the center console and pressed my lips to his, and it was soft and sad and tasted like goodbye, or maybe hello. I couldn't tell anymore. And when I pulled back, he was looking at me like I'd just given him oxygen after drowning. And I said, "I'm not ready yet, not ready to trust you, not ready to forgive you, but I'm trying to see past my pain, trying to believe that people can change." And he cupped my face, gentle and reverent, and he said, "Take all the time you need. I'll wait forever if that's what it takes." And I got out of the car before I could change my mind, before I could invite him upstairs, before I could fall back into old patterns. And I walked into my building without looking back, and I made it to my apartment before I started crying, before the weight of it all crashed over me, the impossible choice between safety and passion, between healing and hoping, between protecting myself and risking everything for a man who'd already proven he could destroy me. Chapter 6, The Breaking Point. The invitation came on a Wednesday, heavy black cardstock with gold embossing that screamed money and danger in equal measure, an invitation to Dmitry Volkov's annual gala, and I stared at it for a full minute, trying to figure out why a Russian arms dealer would be inviting me to anything, and then I saw the note attached in unfamiliar handwriting that said, "Come alone, beautiful girl, let's discuss your boyfriend's debts." And my blood ran cold because I didn't have a boyfriend, hadn't had one in months, but Dmitry apparently didn't know that, and the implication was clear. He thought I was still with my mob boss, thought I could be used as leverage, thought I was a weakness that could be exploited. I should have thrown the invitation away, should have called him and warned him, should have done anything except what I actually did, which was put on the most devastating dress I owned, diamond white that made me look like an ice queen, and show up at Dmitry's mansion alone like I had a death wish. And maybe I did. Maybe I was so tired of the game, so exhausted from months of pushing him away while wanting him desperately, that I'd decided to do something monumentally stupid just to feel something other than this endless cycle of anger and want. And when I walked into that ballroom full of dangerous men and dangerous women, I felt eyes on me immediately, predatory and assessing, and I lifted my chin and smiled like I belonged there, like I wasn't terrified, like I hadn't just walked into a den of wolves wearing sheep's clothing. Dmitry found me within minutes, tall and blonde and handsome in that cold Nordic way, and he kissed my hand with old-world charm and said, "I wasn't sure you'd come. Most women have more sense than to accept invitations from men like me." And I said, "Most women haven't spent the last few months learning how to be dangerous from a man far scarier than you." And he laughed, delighted, and he said, "Ah yes, your mob boss. Tell me, is he still pining after you, still making everyone around him miserable with his heartbreak?" And I said, "We're not together anymore." And I watched interest sharpen in Dmitry's eyes, watched him reassess me, recalculate my value. And he said, "How fascinating. So you're here on your own, unprotected, unclaimed." And the way he said it made my skin crawl, but I smiled anyway and said, "I'm here because your note intrigued me. What debts were you referring to?" He guided me through the crowd with a hand on my lower back that felt nothing like when my mob boss touched me, felt proprietary in all the wrong ways, and he said, "Your former lover killed 3 of my men last year over a territory dispute, and I've been waiting for the right moment to collect payment. And then I heard about you, heard about the beautiful woman who brought him to his knees, and I thought, what better payment than taking the thing he values most?" And ice flooded my veins, genuine fear, because I'd walked into this thinking I was in control, and I'd just realized I was prey, and I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "He doesn't value me anymore. We're done. Using me won't hurt him." And Dmitri smiled, cold and amused, and he said, "Darling, the whole city knows he's been destroying himself over you, knows he'd burn everything he's built to get you back, and whether you're together or not doesn't change the fact that you're his." Weakness and weaknesses are meant to be exploited. I tried to pull away, but his hand tightened on my back, painful now. And he said, "Don't make a scene. There are 20 armed men in this room, and all of them work for me. You came here alone. No one knows where you are, and if you scream, if you fight, it will only make this harder." And panic clawed at my throat, but I forced it down, forced myself to think, to calculate, to figure out how to get out of this. And I said, "What do you want from me?" And he said, "I want you to call him, tell him to come here, tell him to come alone. And then I want to watch his face when he realizes he's trading his life for yours." And I said, "He won't come, won't trade himself for me. We're not together anymore." But even as I said it, I knew it was a lie, knew that despite everything, despite the betrayal and the months of pain, he'd come for me, would walk into a trap if it meant keeping me safe. And that knowledge sat heavy in my chest because it meant he loved me, really loved me, enough to die for me. Dmitri pulled out his phone, handed it to me and said, "Call him now, or I start hurting you and send him pictures until he comes anyway." And I took the phone with shaking hands and dialed the number I'd memorized years ago, the number I'd deleted and redialed 100 times over the last months. And it rang twice before his voice came through, rough like I'd woken him. Yes, just that one word. And I said, "It's me." And I heard him sit up, heard the rustle of sheets, heard the immediate alertness in his voice when he said, "What's wrong? Where are you? Are you okay?" And I said, "I'm at Dmitri Volkov's gala, and I need you to come here, alone. He says you owe him a debt." And the silence on the other end was deafening, was loaded with understanding and fury and fear, and he said, voice deadly calm, "Put him on the phone." I handed the phone to Dmitri and watched his face as he spoke, watched him smile cruel and satisfied, and he said, "Your woman walked into my house alone, unprotected, practically gift-wrapped, and now she's mine unless you want to negotiate her return." And I couldn't hear what my mob boss said, but I watched Dmitri's expression change, watched confidence become caution, and he said, "I want you here, unarmed, alone, in 30 minutes, or I start taking pieces of her and sending them to you." And he hung up, handed me back to one of his men, and I was escorted to a room upstairs, locked in, and I sat on the edge of an ornate bed trying not to panic, trying not to think about what I'd done, how monumentally stupid I'd been, how my pride and my pain had led me to make a choice that might get us both killed. 28 minutes later, I heard gunfire, heard shouting, heard the unmistakable sounds of violence echoing through the mansion, and my door burst open and there he was, my mob boss, covered in blood that probably wasn't his, holding a gun in one hand, and he looked at me like I was the only thing in the world that mattered, crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled me into his arms, and he said, voice rough, "Are you hurt? Did he touch you? Did anyone hurt you?" And I shook my head, couldn't speak past the lump in my throat, and he held me tighter, pressed his face into my hair, and he said, "I told you to stay away from this world, told you it was dangerous, told you that loving me would get you killed, and you didn't listen. You never listen." And I said, "You came alone." He said to come alone and unarmed, and you came anyway. And he pulled back, cupped my face, and he said, "Of course I came. You think I wouldn't burn the whole city down to get to you. You think I care about my life more than yours. You're everything. You've always been everything. And if I have to die to keep you safe, then that's a trade I'll make every single time." We made it out of that mansion through a back entrance. His men had apparently ignored his orders to stay away, and had come anyway, had created enough chaos for us to escape. And in the car ride back to the city, he held my hand so tight it almost hurt. And he said, "Why did you go there? Why did you walk into that alone? Are you trying to get yourself killed?" And I said honestly, "I don't know. I saw the invitation, and I wanted to feel something other than this. Constant ache. Wanted to do something reckless. Wanted to prove I didn't need you to protect me. And he said, "You don't need me to protect you. You're the strongest person I know. But that doesn't mean you should walk into danger just to prove a point." And I looked at him, really looked at him, at the blood on his shirt and the fear still lingering in his eyes, and I said, "You could have died tonight, could have been killed walking into that trap, and you did it anyway, came. For me anyway, even after everything I've done to hurt you, even after months of me pushing you away." He pulled the car over, right there on the side of the highway, and he turned to face me, and he said, "I would die 1,000 times if it meant keeping you safe. I would trade everything I have, everything I am, for your life, and that's not going to change no matter how much you push me away, no matter how much you hate me, no matter how long this punishment lasts, because I love you. I've always loved you, and I will love you until my last breath, whether you forgive me or not." And something in me broke, finally broke, because I'd been so focused on making him hurt, on making him pay, on proving my power, that I'd forgotten this, forgotten what it felt like to be loved so completely, so desperately, so absolutely that someone would walk into certain death just to save you. And I started crying, really crying, months of pain and anger and love all pouring out at once, and I said through my tears, "I don't know how to forgive you, don't know how to trust you again, don't know how to believe that this won't happen again, but I'm so tired of fighting, so tired of pretending I don't love you, so tired of this war we've been waging against each other." He pulled me across the center console, pulled me into his lap, and he held me while I cried, stroked my hair and whispered, I know, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for everything I did, for every moment of pain I caused you, for breaking something beautiful because I was too stupid and arrogant to appreciate what I had." And I said, "I've been horrible to you, punishing you endlessly, making you suffer, enjoying your pain, and tonight I almost got us both killed because I was so caught up in this game that I forgot what actually matters." And he said, "You weren't being horrible. You were protecting yourself, setting boundaries, making me earn back what I lost. And you had every right to do that, every right to make me prove I'd changed before letting me back into your heart." And I pulled back enough to look at him, to see his face streaked with my tears. And I said, "Did you change? Are you different now? Or are you just performing to get?" He looked at me with those dark eyes that had always seen too much, and he said, "I'm different. I had to be, because losing you showed me who I really was, showed me that all my power and money and control meant nothing if I didn't have you. And I've spent every day since trying to become someone worthy of your trust, someone who understands that love requires sacrifice and commitment, and putting you first, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." And I kissed him. Then, soft and desperate, tasting salt and blood and everything we'd been through, and he kissed me back like I was air, and he'd been drowning. And when we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, both crying, both holding on to each other like letting go meant falling into an abyss we might not survive. Chapter 7. When Walls Fall. We drove to his penthouse in silence, my hand still in his, and when we got inside, he tried to clean the blood off himself, but I stopped him, took the towel from his hands and did it myself, wiping away the evidence of violence he'd committed to save me, and my hands were shaking because I kept seeing it, kept replaying the moment he'd burst through that door looking like death incarnate, willing to trade his life for mine without hesitation, and I said, voice barely above a whisper, "You could have died tonight." And he said, "But you didn't. That's all that matters." And I pressed my forehead against his chest and said, "No, you matter. Your life matters. And I've spent so long punishing you that I forgot that hurting you was hurting me too, forgot that this war I've been waging was destroying us both." He wrapped his arms around me, held me close, and I could feel his heart beating steady and strong under my palm. And I said, "I need to tell you something, need to explain why I've been so cruel, why I couldn't just forgive you even when I could see you were trying." And he said, "You don't have to explain. I understand." But I shook my head and said, "No, I need to say this, need you to understand what it was like." And I pulled back, led him to the couch, and we sat down, facing each other, and I took a deep breath and said, "When I walked in on you with her, when I saw you together, something inside me died, something fundamental that I didn't even know I could lose. And it wasn't just trust, it was worse than that. It was my belief in my own worth, in my own value, because if I wasn't enough for you, if you needed someone else, even when you had me, then what did that say about me, about my desirability, about whether I was worthy of being?" I watched him flinch, watched pain cross his face, but I continued, "And I know, logically I know, that your infidelity wasn't about me, wasn't a reflection of my inadequacy, but knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally are two completely different things. And every night for months, I lay awake wondering what she had that I didn't, what she gave you that I couldn't, what was wrong with me that you needed to look elsewhere, and tears were streaming down my face now, but I didn't stop them, didn't try to be strong, just let myself be vulnerable for the first time since this all started. And I said, I've been punishing you, making you suffer, keeping you at a distance, because I was terrified, absolutely terrified, that if I let you back in, if I forgave you and trusted you again, you'd do it again, and I wouldn't survive it, wouldn't survive being broken twice by the same person. He reached for my hand, laced his fingers through mine, and he said, voice rough with emotion, there was nothing wrong with you, nothing you lacked, nothing she had that you didn't. My cheating was about my own brokenness, my own inability to believe I deserved something good, and instead of protecting what we had, instead of being grateful for you, I sabotaged it, destroyed it, proved to myself that I was exactly as unworthy as I'd always believed. And I said, but that doesn't help. Knowing it was about you and not me doesn't make the pain less, doesn't make the images go away, doesn't stop me from wondering every time you're late, every time you look at another woman, every time you're out of my sight, whether you're doing it again, whether I'm being a fool for giving you another chance. He pulled me closer, pulled me into his lap, and he said, I know the trust is gone and words can't rebuild it. Only time can, only consistency can, only me choosing you every single day even when it's hard, especially when it's hard, and I'm prepared to do that. Prepared to be transparent and patient and understanding while you heal, because I did this, I caused this damage, and it's my responsibility to help fix it. And I said, but what if I can't heal? What if the wound is too deep? What if I'm broken in ways that can't be repaired? And he cupped my face, made me look at him, and he said, then we'll be broken together, and I'll love every scarred, damaged, beautiful part of you, and we'll build something new from the pieces, something stronger than what we had before, because it's been tested and survived. I kissed him then, desperate and needy, and he kissed me back with equal fervor, and his hands were in my hair, and mine were fisted in his shirt, and we were trying to get closer, trying to erase the months of distance, trying to find our way back to each other through touch and taste, and the simple fact of being together. And when we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, and I said, I've been so angry at you, and that anger felt good, felt powerful, felt like armor protecting me from getting hurt again. But tonight, when I thought you might die, when I realized you'd walked into a trap for me, the armor cracked, and underneath it was just this overwhelming love that I've been trying to deny, trying to bury, trying to pretend didn't exist. He stroked my hair, gentle and reverent, and I continued, I've been horrible to you, making you watch me with other men, enjoying your suffering, using your love for me as a weapon to hurt you, and I justified it by saying you deserved it, that you needed to feel what I felt. But the truth is, I was scared, terrified actually, that if I stopped punishing you, if I let myself be vulnerable again, you'd have all the power, would be able to destroy me completely. And I couldn't let that happen, couldn't risk being that helpless again. And he said, you were never horrible, you were protecting yourself, and you had every right to. I gave you every reason not to trust me, every reason to keep your walls up, every reason to make me prove myself before letting me back in. I stood up, paced to the window, looked out at the city lights blurring through my tears, and I said, do you know what the worst part is? The absolute worst part of being betrayed by someone you love? It's not even the betrayal itself. It's what it does to you afterward, how it changes you, makes you suspicious and guarded and mean, makes you question everything, makes you unable to accept love even when it's being offered genuinely, because you're so convinced it's going to be taken away, so certain that happiness is temporary and pain is inevitable. And I hate that. Hate what your infidelity turned me into. Hate that I became someone who found pleasure in others' suffering, who used manipulation and games instead of honest communication. He came up behind me, wrapped his arms around my waist, and he said, you didn't become someone else. You adapted. You survived. You did what you needed to do to protect yourself while you healed, and there's no shame in that, no weakness in self-preservation. And I leaned back against him, let myself be held, and I said, but I'm tired of being that person, tired of the games and the walls and the constant fear. I want to be the woman I was before, the one who loved openly, and trusted completely and believed in forever, but I don't know if I can get back to her. Don't know if she even exists anymore or if she died that day in your office. He turned me around, made me face him, and he said, maybe she doesn't exist anymore, Maybe you can't go back to who you were, but maybe you can become someone even better. Someone who's been tested and survived. Someone who knows her own strength. Someone who loves with her eyes open instead of closed. Someone who's powerful not despite her scars, but because of them. And I looked at him, really looked at him, and I said, "When did you become so wise?" And he smiled, sad and small, and he said, "When I lost you. When I had to examine every part of myself to figure out how to become worthy of another chance. When I realized that growth comes from pain, and I'd caused enough pain for both of us to grow exponentially." I took his face in my hands, looked into those dark eyes that had seen every part of me, and I said, "I forgive you, not because you've suffered enough, or because you've proven yourself, or because I'm tired of being angry, but because holding on to this resentment is killing me, is keeping me stuck in the past, is preventing me from moving forward, and I want to move forward, want to see if we can build something real from these ruins, want to try again even though I'm terrified, even though every instinct tells me to protect myself, because the alternative is spending the rest of my life wondering what if, and I can't live with that regret." And I watched his eyes fill with tears, watched his careful control finally crack, and he said, voice breaking, "Thank you. Thank you for giving me another chance, for trusting me with your heart again, for being brave enough to risk being hurt, and I swear to you, I swear on everything I have that I will spend every day proving I'm worthy of this gift." We held each other as the sun started to rise, painting the city in shades of pink and gold, and I felt something shift inside me, felt the anger that had been sustaining me for months finally release its grip, felt the possibility of healing, of moving forward, of building something new from the ashes of what we'd destroyed. And it was terrifying, and exhilarating, and absolutely right. And I said, "I'm still scared, still worried this won't work, still have moments where I doubt everything, but I want to try. Want to see if love is enough when it comes with honesty and respect and commitment." And he said, "We'll figure it out together, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment at a time. And when you're scared, I'll be steady. And when you doubt, I'll remind you why we're worth fighting for. And when you need space, I'll give it to you. Because this isn't about possession anymore. It's about partnership, about choosing each other freely, instead of out of obligation or fear." Okay, everyone, before we wrap this story up with a bang, tell me in the comments, what was your favorite moment? The provocation at the ball? The scene in the office? Dimitri's rescue? And from 0 to 10, what score would you give this story? If you enjoyed this unique dark romance, full of emotional layers and realistic characters, subscribe to the channel, because here we don't make shallow stories. We make stories that leave a mark. Let's go to the grand finale. Chapter 8, Redemption. 3 months after that night at Dimitri's mansion, 3 months of slowly rebuilding what we'd destroyed, I woke up in his arms and still felt that flutter of disbelief, and he must have sensed it, because he pulled me closer and said, voice rough with sleep, "I'm here. I'm real. We're real. Stop overthinking." And I turned to face him, studied his face in the morning light, and I said, "How do you always know?" And he smiled, traced my jawline with his fingers, and he said, "Because I know you. Know that you still wake up sometimes expecting this to fall apart, and I understand that trust takes time to rebuild." He'd been different these last 3 months, fundamentally different, and it wasn't just the big gestures like coming home early every night or letting me have complete access to his phone and schedule. It was the small things, the way he checked in constantly, the way he actually listened when I talked, the way he'd canceled business trips to stay with me on bad days, the way he'd gone to therapy, actual therapy, to work through whatever brokenness had led him to sabotage us. And I'd gone too, separately and together. And it was hard, brutally hard, but it was necessary, was the foundation we needed to build something lasting. I got out of bed, pulled on his shirt, and he followed me to the kitchen, wrapped his arms around me from behind while I made coffee, and he said, "I have something to tell you, and I need you to hear me out before you react." And immediately my stomach dropped, and he said quickly, "Nothing bad, I promise. Just something I need to say." And I turned in his arms, looked up at him, and I said, "Okay, I'm listening." He took a deep breath and said, "I saw her yesterday. The woman from before. She came to my office wanting to talk, and I could have handled it quietly, could have kept it to myself, but I made a promise to be transparent, to never keep secrets again no matter how small. So I'm telling you. And I need you to know that I didn't let her in, didn't speak to her beyond telling her to leave, didn't give her a single moment of my time, because you're the only woman who gets my time. I felt the old jealousy rise up sharp and hot, felt the insecurity that still lived in my chest despite months of reassurance. And I said, "What did she want?" And he said, "I don't know. I didn't ask, didn't care, just told security to escort her out and add her to the list of people who aren't allowed in the building. And I studied his face, looking for deception, but all I saw was honesty, raw and uncomfortable honesty. And I said, "Thank you for telling me. I know that was hard. I know you probably debated keeping it to yourself to spare me the pain, but I appreciate the transparency, appreciate that you're keeping your promise even when it's difficult." He pressed a kiss to my forehead and said, "I'll always tell you, even when it's hard, even when I'm worried about your reaction, because secrets are what destroyed us the first time, and I won't let that happen again." And I held him tight and said, "I still have moments where I doubt, where I'm scared that history will repeat itself, but then you do things like this. Choose honesty even when it's uncomfortable, and it reminds me why I gave you another chance. Reminds me that you really have changed." That afternoon, he took me somewhere I didn't recognize, drove us out of the city to a house on the water, beautiful and private and full of light, and when I asked where we were, he said, "Somewhere I want to show you, somewhere that means something." And he led me inside, and the house was empty but elegant. And he said, "I bought this place 2 months ago, been working on it in secret, wanted it to be perfect before I showed you." And I walked through the rooms, saw the care he'd taken, the reading nook by the window, the chef's kitchen, the studio space with perfect light for painting, and I turned to him with tears in my eyes and said, Why did you do this?" He came to me, took my hands, and he said, "Because the penthouse has too many bad memories, too many ghosts, and I wanted us to have a place that was just ours, untainted by the past, somewhere we could build new memories, somewhere you could feel safe and loved and home." And he pulled a key from his pocket, pressed it into my palm, and he said, "This is yours. Whether you want to live here with me or just use it as a retreat when you need space, it's yours. No strings attached. Just me trying to show you that I'm invested in our future, that I'm planning for forever." I looked at the key, looked at this man who'd broken me, and then spent months piecing me back together, who'd proven through consistent action that he was worthy of another chance. And I said, "I love you. I've never stopped loving you even when I hated you, even when I was trying to destroy you. And I want this, want us, want to build a life together that's built on honesty and respect, and choosing each other every single day." And he said, "I love you too, more than I ever thought possible to love someone. And I know I don't deserve this second chance, don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the gift you've given me." We made love in that empty house, slow and tender and full of promise. And it was different than before, less about possession and more about connection, less about control and more about surrender. And afterward, we lay wrapped in each other, and I said, "I forgive you, really truly forgive you, not just with my words, but with my heart. And I'm letting go of the resentment, letting go of the need to punish you, letting go of the fear that you'll hurt me again, because holding onto all of that was poisoning me, was preventing me from being fully present in what we're building." He kissed me deep and meaningful and said, "I don't take this lightly, don't take your forgiveness for granted. I know that trust is something I'll have to earn every single day for the rest of our lives, and I'm prepared to do that, grateful for the opportunity, because losing you taught me what actually matters, taught me that all the power and money in the world means nothing if you don't have someone to share it with, someone who sees past all the armor to the man underneath and loves him anyway." I traced patterns on his chest, felt his heartbeat steady under my palm, and I said, "You're not broken anymore. You did the work to heal, went to therapy, examined your patterns, figured out why you sabotaged what we had, and that took real courage, and I'm proud of you for doing it, proud of you for becoming someone better instead of just making excuses." And he said, "I had the best motivation, had you, had the possibility of us, had the knowledge that if I didn't change, I'd lose the only thing that ever really mattered." We stayed in that house until sunset, planning and dreaming and talking about the future with honesty and realistic expectations instead of just passion and promises. And when we finally drove back to the city, I felt lighter than I had in months, felt like maybe we really could do this, could build something lasting from the ruins of what we'd destroyed. And he reached over and took my hand and said, "Thank you for not giving up on us, for fighting through the pain, for being brave enough to try again. You could have walked away, could have chosen someone safer and easier, but you stayed, and that means everything to me." I looked at him, at this dangerous, beautiful man who'd learned to be gentle, who'd learned to be vulnerable, who'd learned that strength wasn't about control but about surrender, and I said, "I stayed because underneath all the hurt and anger I could see you trying, could see you changing, could see that your remorse was real and your commitment to growth was genuine, and that gave me hope, hope that we could survive this, hope that love could be stronger than betrayal if both people were willing to do the work." We got back to the penthouse and he pulled me close, held me like I was something precious, something irreplaceable, and he whispered against my hair, "Marry me, not now, not until you're completely ready, not until every shadow of doubt is gone, but someday, when you're sure, when you trust me completely, marry me, and let me spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of you." And I pulled back to look at him, saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the hope and fear mixed together, and I said, "Someday, yes, when we're both ready, when we've built something so strong that nothing can shake it, I'll marry you, and it will be a beginning, not an ending, the start of the rest of our lives together." He kissed me then, soft and sweet, and it tasted like forgiveness and redemption and new beginnings, tasted like second chances and hard-won trust, tasted like love that had been tested and survived. And when we finally broke apart, we were both smiling, both crying a little, both understanding that we'd been given something rare, something precious, the chance to take something broken and make it beautiful again. And as I fell asleep in his arms that night, I felt peace for the first time in months, felt hope for our future, felt gratitude for the journey we'd taken, because sometimes the only way to build something strong is to first watch it crumble, to see exactly where the weaknesses were, and to rebuild with intention and care and a commitment to doing it right this time. And whatever came next, whatever challenges we'd face them together, choosing each other every single day, building a love story that was messy and imperfect and absolutely real. The end.